Hello and welcome back to the Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 108 called The Last of the Sasanians. In the last episode, we heard about the devastating Roman defeat at the Battle of Yarmuk, perhaps Rome's greatest defeat, and now we're going to move east to hear about Persia's equivalent of Yarmuk, the Battle of Quodicea. The Sasanian army was defeated at this battle and, unlike the Roman army, never recovered. The Persian capital, Ctesiphon, fell shortly afterwards, and although Persian resistance wasn't finally extinguished until 651, it was curtains for the Sasanian Empire. The same question we asked about Yarmuk now requires an even more urgent answer for Persia and the Battle of Quodicea. How did the fledgling Arab state do it? How did it inflict a defeat so severe on the second superpower of late antiquity that it proved fatal? The question has long baffled historians, and the conventional answers are the same as those used to explain Rome's defeat at Yarmuk, i.e. Roman-Persian exhaustion after their long war together, with the Arabs' invincible fighting spirit enthused by the new religious zeal. Now, I don't disagree with these two reasons, but I don't think they provide the entire answer. In the last episode, I suggested at Yarmuk the Arab army was probably larger and better than the Roman. And in this episode, I want to look at whether the same was true at Quodicea. So let's start by looking at the background to the Arab-Persian War. And the first point is that the historical relationship between Persia and Arabia differed greatly from that between Rome and Arabia. For the Romans, Arabia had always been of limited interest. It was on the periphery of their empire and their consciousness. The Romans had never invaded Arabia. I think they regarded it a little like they regarded ancient Scotland, or Caledonia as they called it. Everyone knew where it was, but no one wanted to go there. But for the Persians, it was quite different. Arabia was on their doorstep. It was situated not only adjacent to Mesopotamia, what we call today Iraq, but also just across the Persian Gulf. And we shouldn't forget that in Sasanian times, modern Iraq was a vital part of the Persian Empire. Indeed, the ancient Sasanian capital, Ctesiphon, was located in what is today Iraq, about 20 miles southeast of modern Baghdad. This was because ancient Persia was much bigger than modern Persia, or modern Iran, a bit like ancient Germania was much bigger than modern Germany. Ancient Persia stretched from Iraq in the west to modern Azerbaijan in the northwest, which was part of the ancient land of Media, as well as into modern Turkmenistan, some of which was part of ancient Parthia, and of course included the original Persian heartlands in the south along the Persian Gulf, from which the Sasanians came and where the ancient Achaemenid capital of Persepolis was located. So the Arabs were a neighbour to the Persians, a little like the Gauls had been to the Romans. And what makes it even more surprising that they could destroy the Persian Empire was that historically most of the Arab tribes had been subservient to the Persians. I mentioned back in episode 106 that for a time in the 6th century the Persians had annexed the Arab kingdom of Himyar in what is now modern Yemen in southern Arabia. But much more important for the Persians was their domination of the most powerful Arab tribe in the north of Arabia, next to Persian Mesopotamia, who were called the Lakhmids, sometimes referred to as the Nasrids, who were their ruling dynasty, representing the Banu Lakham tribe. The Lakhmids occupied a vast area from southern Iraq down the coastline of eastern Arabia as far south as modern Oman. They were one of the most sophisticated of the Arab tribes, with their capital at Al-Hira, which was reputed to be a large town somewhat similar to Mecca in the west. And the Lakhmids had a long history of being tributaries and allies of the Persians, just as the Ghassanid Arabs were allies of Rome. Indeed, the two sides, Lakhmid and Ghassanid, often fought each other for control of territory along the northern borders of the Arabian desert. And this leads us on to a point that I think was significant in explaining both the rise of Islam and the fall of Persia, which is that at some point during the long Roman-Persian War between 602 and 628, the Lakhmids took advantage of Persian preoccupation with fighting Rome to throw off the Persian yoke and defeated a Persian army at the Battle of Daiquar, otherwise known as the Battle of the Camel's Udder, thereby gaining independence. This meant the Persians lost control of the eastern half of the Arabian Peninsula at exactly when Muhammad was extending his new Islamic State. Indeed, during the Ridda Wars, the Lakhmids joined the growing Islamic State, providing Abu Bakr with a springboard for invasion of Persia. If, for example, Persia had kept control of the Lakhmid kingdom, then it might have served as a buffer state between it and Islam. Or indeed, the Persians might even have been able to use the Lakhmids to prevent the spread of Islam across Arabia. But obviously this didn't happen, and the Lakhmids instead fell under the sway of Abu Bakr's expanded Islam during the Ridda Wars, so that the Persians had to face the full force of Islam right on their borders. What happened next has been the subject of much scholarly ink, since our chronology is confused in the Islamic sources, with some suggesting Abu Bakr invaded both Roman Palestine and Sasanian Mesopotamia simultaneously. But, as I've mentioned before, these sources were written 100 to 200 years after the event and are notoriously unreliable. The scholarly consensus now favours the more plausible chronology that the Arabs first concentrated against the Romans and won the Battle of Yarmuk, and then launched an attack against Persia. This is clearly stated by our earliest and most reliable source, as I've mentioned in the last episode, the Armenian bishop Sebeos, who says after the Battle of Yarmuk, the Arab army divided into three, quote, "One part went to Egypt and seized the country as far as Alexandria, one part was in the north opposing the Roman Empire, and the third part went to the east against the kingdom of Persia." We'll come back to the invasion of Egypt in another episode, but there's no doubt this happened after the Arabs had defeated the Persians, so even Sebeos was not correct here. And it's an important point because the Arab victories were carefully planned to hit their enemies one by one. The Romans were first, and after victory at Yarmuk in 636, the Arabs turned most of their army against the Persians in 637. Now, initially, things went well. They won several small engagements and advanced to the walls of Ctesiphon itself, which they besieged. But there the Arab success ended. The Persian Shah Yazdegerd III had not been idle. Indeed, he'd arguably done more than Heraclius by mobilizing in central Iran a large army replete with elephants and heavy cavalry, and in 637 this advanced against the Arabs, who retreated just as they had done when Heraclius's army appeared in Syria. But whereas at Yarmuk the Arabs lured the Romans into fighting on unfavourable ground, on this occasion they got it badly wrong. They retreated to the west bank of the Euphrates and met the advancing Persians near modern Kufa, about 170 miles south of modern Baghdad. The Persian army was led by Bahman Jedua, and the Arabs were led by Abu Ubaid, who'd been the commander-in-chief of the victorious army at Yarmuk. The Persians enticed the Arabs to cross the Euphrates using the only bridge across the river. The so-called Battle of the Bridge turned into a tremendous victory for the Persians, who trapped the Arabs against the Euphrates and used their war elephants to rampage through the Arab ranks. The Arab general Abu Ubaid was killed when he was trampled underfoot by an elephant, and the Bedouin horses panicked at the sight of the elephants. There was carnage as the Arab army retreated, but became jammed on the single bridge, leaving thousands to be slaughtered or to drown in the river. We don't know the size of Arab casualties, but it's likely several thousand were killed. This was a genuine crisis for Islam. Its extraordinary rise to power looked as if it might be reversed within months. The Arabs, led by Umar, retreated into the deserts of Arabia. And there, in a remarkably short amount of time, Umar raised a new army from across Arabia. To do this, he lifted a ban on those Arab tribes who'd revolted against Muhammad after his death in the Ridda Wars from joining the army, and opened recruitment to all Arabs who were willing to fight for Islam. Instead of support for Islam collapsing, the opposite happened, and Umar could return to the fray with a formidable new army. He appointed an experienced soldier, Sad Wakas, as commander, and the Arabs advanced to meet the Persians for a second round. The two armies met at Qadisiyah, a small town close to the Euphrates in modern southwest Iraq. This was a critical moment for the emerging Islamic State. Defeat at Qadisiyah would almost certainly have consigned Islam to a footnote in history, rather similar to what happened to Palmyra, the Arab oasis state which rose to fame in the 3rd century AD, only to be quickly crushed by the Emperor Aurelian. Now, one of our problems with this battle is that the Islamic chroniclers, writing centuries after the event, were aware of how critical this battle was in Islam's history. For example, the great 9th and 10th century Islamic scholar and historian al-Tabari, the author of a famous Islamic history of the world, devoted no less than 160 pages to this one battle. Now, this might sound great because we have a lot of information about it, but the problem is that the battle passed into the realms of Islamic folklore, which means it's almost impossible to separate fact from fiction. The Islamic version of events is, in short, that a ragged band of heroes came out from the desert to face the huge Persian army and defeated it because of their heroism and devotion to Islam. They say the battle lasted for 4 bloody days, with heavy casualties on both sides. To be fair to the Islamic records, they say there were acts of heroism on both sides, Persian as well as Arab. The fighting concentrated around the Persian elephants, which had brought them victory at the Battle of the Bridge, and which gave them the advantage for the first 3 days of battle, until the Arabs turned the tables on the Persians with a bold attack led by Sad Wakas, who infiltrated the elephant corps and mutilated the animals, causing them to stampede back into the Persian lines, wreaking considerable destruction and chaos. Another tactic that brought the Arabs victory was they used camels to frighten the Persian horses, something which they achieved by dressing them up to look like strange monsters which spooked the Persian horses. Similar to the Battle of Yarmuk, it was on the last day of the battle that the Persian army caved in. The Persian commander Rustam was killed, and the survivors streamed east. It was a decisive Arab victory, perhaps the most important in all of Islamic history. It sealed the fate of the Sasanian dynasty, since Ctesiphon fell 18 months later and Yazdegerd fled to Media, where in 642 the last Sasanian army was destroyed at the Battle of Nahawand, and Yazdegerd was finally killed in 651. But now the questions begin. Principally, how were the Arabs able to inflict such a devastating defeat on the Sasanians? One thing the voluminous Islamic sources are insistent upon is that the Arab army at Qadisiyah was smaller than the Persian. But was that actually true? If we look at non-Islamic sources, what little evidence we have does actually support the Islamic view that they were facing a very formidable Persian army. Pretty much our only reliable non-Islamic source, the Armenian bishop Sabaeus, says, quote, "The army of the land of the Medes gathered under the command of their general Rustam, 80,000 armed men," end quote. When Ceballos talks numbers, he doesn't usually exaggerate, although 80,000 would have been an enormous army for this time, and I think it was probably half or less than that. But nevertheless, I think it was still a significant army and probably larger and better than the Roman army had been at Yarmuk. The Islamic sources talk of elephants, heavy cavalry and horse archers, and all of this sounds authentic. And most importantly of all, it shouldn't be forgotten that this Persian army had just beaten the Arabs at the Battle of the Bridge. So the Persians were genuinely a force to be reckoned with. But this just makes it even more baffling that the Arabs could snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, and historians have never really come up with a convincing explanation. One historian has put forward an interesting argument that Sasanian government was never as centralised and effective as we've thought, and was in fact crippled by deep divisions between the Parthians on one hand and the Persians who backed the Sasanians on the other. This was reflected not only in a fierce civil war between 628 and 632, but even when Yazdegerd III seized the throne, the Parthian nobility were in effect in open rebellion against him. This assertion is because Parthian coins minted after 632, when Yazdegerd became Shah, didn't carry his name. Now, I think there may well be some truth in this, but I think this historian goes too far when she suggests there's been a serious misdating of the timing of the Arab offensive into Persia, which was actually much earlier, she claims, than thought in the period between 628 to 32, so during this Persian civil war. And this theory has been rejected by almost all other historians. And I think that's right, not least because it contradicts the normally reliable and logical chronology Ceballos has left us with, and it doesn't explain why the Persian army at Qadisiyah was apparently so large. So, how do we explain the Arab victory? Well, I want to put forward a new theory that the Arab army was actually larger than the Persian at Qadisiyah. Now, I can't prove this, but I think it makes sense in the context of a new theory about the rise of Islam, which is emerging among scholars. And this theory is about the effects of climate change in the 6th and 7th centuries. As we discussed back in episode 87, it's now widely recognised that something extraordinary happened to the world's climate in the year 536, something that was the biggest change in climate since the end of the last ice age 12,000 years ago, and even bigger than what's happening today with global warming. And this was a series of massive volcanic eruptions around the globe in the year 536, which was so severe they caused global cooling by as much as 3 degrees centigrade. Paleoclimatologists now call the period from 536 to around 660 the Late Antique Little Ice Age. Initially, this led to widespread famine, and in 541, possibly, to the first outbreak of bubonic plague. But how does this, you might ask, explain the rise of Islam? The answer is not so much in terms of the damage done to the economies of Rome and Persia, but of how ancient Arabia escaped this damage. For the evidence suggests the plague hardly touched the Arabian Peninsula. Indeed, we know the Arabs were shocked to find the disease when their armies advanced into the affected areas of the Roman and Persian empires. So we're now confronted with a whole new dimension to explaining Arab success. Were the Arabs given a critical advantage over Rome and Persia because their populations were disease-free, and not just disease-free, for the latest research into climate cooling in the late Antique Little Ice Age suggests the environmental impact was different in different places. And while a cooler climate may have been damaging for most of the territories of the Roman and Persian empires, paleoclimatologists believe it was positive for the water-parched, arid Arab peninsula. Climatic cooling helped to increase rainfall in Arabia. Therefore, in the 7th century, ancient Arabia was greener and agriculturally more productive than at any time in its history for thousands of years. Presumably, this caused a population increase in Arabia just when there was a population decrease in the Roman and Persian empires. So, have we at last discovered the missing link? that helps to explain how the Arabs triumphed over Roman Persia. Find out in the next podcast episode when we'll look at this fascinating subject in more detail. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And we'll continue with the extraordinary story of the rise of Islam in 2 weeks' time on the 8th of March. And in the meantime, if you're looking for something to watch, check out my new YouTube videos on the fall of the Roman Empire, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.